Oakhaven tried to erase will never truly be forgotten. Her story, a chilling testament to the unseen, continues to resonate, a permanent eerie whisper in the collective consciousness, proving that some truths, once seen, can never truly be unseen. Residents. Modern researchers, less bound by the town's original vow of silence, began to piece together fragments of the story, sensing a deeper, darker truth. Paranormal investigators, drawn by the persistent whispers of a haunted Maine coast, occasionally found their way to Oakhaven. They would report anomalous readings near the site of the old Harrow cottage, strange fluctuations in temperature, and faint, inexplicable EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, recordings that sometimes contained garbled, childlike murmurs. Some even claimed to have captured fleeting images in their photographs, translucent blurs, or the subtle glint of an unnatural eye in the background of an otherwise ordinary shot of the ruins. These modern interpretations, while often sensationalized, reaffirmed the persistent energy of Evelyn's story. The local tourism board, in a darkly ironic twist, would eventually acknowledge the legend of the glass-eyed girl in their brochures, albeit in a carefully sanitized folkloric manner, turning tragedy into a local point of interest. Campers by the old marsh road would share campfire tales of a girl with a reflective eye who appeared in their dreams, whispering warnings of impending bad weather or forgotten dangers. Most profoundly, the narrative of Evelyn Harrow has found new life in online forums and YouTube channels dedicated to historical horror and unexplained mysteries, reaching audiences far beyond the rocky shores of Oakhaven. Here, her story is retold with reverence and terror, analyzed and debated. The old sepia photographs, particularly that haunting image of the girl with the unnervingly pale glassy eye, have become iconic, a visual shorthand for a specific kind of chilling historical dread. The internet, the ultimate mirror of our modern world, now reflects her story to countless curious eyes, ensuring that Evelyn Harrow, the girl who vanished without a trace. Some claimed the dog was still searching for her, others that it was Evelyn herself, transformed into an eternal sentinel. The subtle prophecies attributed to her eye also echoed down through the years. When an old barn mysteriously collapsed, or a beloved pet disappeared, someone, usually an elder, would quietly remark, "Evelyn would have seen that." It was a tacit acknowledgement of her gift, even as they denied her existence. Even those who moved to Oakhaven from outside, unaware of its grim past, sometimes reported strange occurrences. Newcomers would speak of waking in the dead of night with a profound sense of foreboding, or of glimpsing a figure in old-fashioned dress, always turning away before they could get a clear view, leaving only the impression of an unnaturally still, reflective eye. Oakhaven learned that some ghosts do not need to walk the earth in visible form to haunt a place. Their presence can be felt in the lingering shadows, in the whispering pines, and in the collective dread that refused to dissipate, a constant reminder of the girl they had silenced. As the 20th century turned and then progressed, Oakhaven changed, but its foundational layers of dread, laid down by the story of Evelyn Harrow, remained. The old ways faded, the fishing economy waned, and the town slowly welcomed tourists and summer residents, drawn by its rugged beauty. Yet, even in this more modern age, the echoes of Evelyn Harrow persisted, subtly woven into the fabric of the place. Historians and local enthusiasts, poring over old town records, would occasionally stumble upon the gaps and evasions surrounding 1891, noting the odd, almost deliberate lack of information about a missing young woman named Evelyn Harrow. The old newspaper clippings, sparse and guarded, hinted at an unexplained disappearance following trouble at the Harrow, a poor barrier against memory and guilt, a corrosive acid. The missing girl, the glass-eyed prophet, became Oakhaven's enduring wound, a phantom limb that throbbed with unacknowledged pain. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief, yet it was a relief tinged with an unshakable sense of unease, a constant gnawing suspicion that they had merely traded one horror for another. Evelyn Harrow was gone, but her memory, like a shard of glass in the heart of Oakhaven, would continue to reflect untold truths. Decades passed, and Oakhaven tried, with a grim determination, to bury the memory of Evelyn Harrow as deeply as the winter snows buried the land. Her name was rarely spoken. Her cottage eventually fell into disrepair, reclaimed by the encroaching forest. The official record listed her as missing, a convenient euphemism for a truth too terrible to acknowledge. The generation that had known her personally carried the burden of their guilt in haunted eyes and sudden silences, while newer generations grew up with only vague, unsettling warnings about the old Harrow place and its ill-fated history. Yet, some things cannot be simply forgotten. They linger, like the scent of wood smoke on a cold morning or the taste of salt on the wind. The legend of Evelyn Harrow, though suppressed, never truly died. It morphed, adapting to the passage of time, becoming a true piece of Oakhaven folklore. Fishermen out on lonely nights would sometimes swear they saw a faint pale light glinting from the abandoned Harrow property, moving through the skeletal trees. Children, daring each other to venture near the ruins, would return with tales of an inexplicable chill, a sensation of being watched by an unseen gaze. And the black dog, that spectral harbinger, continued to be sighted in Oakhaven, its glowing eyes appearing just before a misfortune, forever tying it to the glass-tide. Harrow plunged Oakhaven into a new kind of terror, a fear far more insidious than the dread her prophecies had inspired. For a living threat could be confronted, but a vanished one left only questions, suspicions, and the chilling vacuum of the unknown. A half-hearted search was mounted once the blizzard subsided. Men trudged through the deep snow, calling out her name, but their efforts were perfunctory, tinged with a collective, unspoken relief. No one truly wanted to find her, not after the horrors she had supposedly brought upon them. They searched the forest, the riverbanks, even the icy harbor, but the earth and the sea yielded no trace of the glass-eyed girl. It was as if the brutal winter night had simply swallowed her whole, leaving behind only the chilling tale of her vanishing. Martha Harrow, when she finally recovered consciousness, was a ghost of her former self. Her mind, ravaged by grief and trauma, offered no clear answers. She spoke in fragmented whispers of the mob, of the cold, of Evelyn's rigid stillness, and then a gaping void in her memory. She often repeated one phrase, her eyes wide with a terror that surpassed her husband's death. The black dog. It was there. And then, a hand, but not theirs. It was a cryptic utterance that haunted the few who heard it, suggesting an element far more supernatural than even the mob's brutality. Reverend Blackwood, burdened by the complicity of his flock, made a final desperate plea for a return to decency, to justice. But his words fell on deaf ears. The town had sealed itself off from its guilt with a powerful collective vow of silence. The incident was to be forgotten, Evelyn Harrow's name struck from their records, her story erased from their collective memory. It was an unspoken pact, forged in fear and shame. If they did not speak of her, perhaps the curse would finally lift. But silences devoured it. The windows gave way next, glass shattering inward with a terrifying crash, cold air and snow blasting into the small parlor. Evelyn, still clutched in her mother's arms, did not cry out. Her body went rigid. Her natural eye widened in terror, but her glass eye, fixed on the splintering door, seemed to glow with an inner light, reflecting a miniature, violent tableau. It showed a chaotic struggle, flashes of desperate resistance, and then darkness. Not the darkness of the night, but an utter, profound void. The door finally splintered inwards, ripped from its hinges by sheer force. The mob surged into the cottage, their torchlight painting monstrous shadows on the walls. What exactly happened next remains obscured by the blizzard, the terrified screams, and the convenient amnesia of those who survived the night. No one could or would recount the precise details. There was a struggle, a blur of figures in the flickering light, Martha's desperate cries, and then a sudden chilling silence that descended even as the wind continued its mournful lament. When the sun finally broke through the clouds the next morning, casting a pristine, innocent white over Oakhaven, a chilling discovery was made. The Harrow cottage stood silent, its door gaping open, its windows broken. Inside, Martha Harrow was found slumped against the hearth, unconscious but alive, her face bruised and her spirit irrevocably shattered. But Evelyn, the glass-eyed girl, was gone. There was no trace of her body, no bloodstains to mark a violent end, no footprints in the newly fallen snow leading away from the house. It was as if she had simply vanished, consumed by the same shadows that had swallowed her father. The only thing left behind was a profound, lingering chill that settled deep into the marrow of Oakhaven, a coldness that would never truly depart. The disappearance of Evelyn H. Yeyo. The night of Candlemas Eve descended upon Oakhaven with an unusual ferocity. The wind, which had merely howled before, now screamed like a banshee, tearing at the eaves of houses and rattling windows with skeletal fingers. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, blinding swirl that quickly devoured the already treacherous roads. It was a night fit for deeds best left unspoken, a night that seemed to conspire with the grim intentions of the town. Martha Harrow, her heart a leaden weight in her chest, had locked and barred every door and window in their small cottage. She had spent the evening huddled with Evelyn by the dying embers of the hearth, a flickering candle casting dancing shadows that mimicked the terrors in her mind. Evelyn, usually so quiet and detached, seemed agitated. Her natural eye darted nervously, while the glass one, dull and unwavering, reflected the chaotic blizzard outside, but also something more. Fleeting, indistinct shapes moving through the swirling white, distorted glints of metal, and the eerie, glowing eyes of the phantom black dog, larger and more defined than ever before. Martha, catching a glimpse, shuddered, pulling her daughter closer. Around midnight, a guttural roar erupted from the darkness. The cottage shook as the front door was struck with brutal force. Shouts, crude and menacing, rose above the wind's shriek. The mob had arrived, their faces obscured by scarves and hats, their fear transformed into a terrifying collective rage. They carried torches, their flames battling the snow, and makeshift weapons, axe handles, pitchforks, heavy stones. Martha, clutching Evelyn, backed away, tears streaming down her face. She pleaded through the splintering door, her voice thin against the din, begging for mercy, for understanding. But there was no reasoning with the mob, no appealing to their lost humanity. Their feet amo. But on the rare occasions she was seen, people swore the glass orb seemed to hold a fleeting, ghostly reflection of a four-legged shadow, a silent, unblinking creature that followed her everywhere. It was a new kind of terror, a tangible manifestation of the curse, a sinister, spectral beast that seemed to confirm what Oakhaven had long feared. Evelyn Harrow was not alone in her affliction. She had a companion, and it was watching, waiting, its loyalty as dark as its form, a silent witness to the tragedy to come. The year 1891 brought with it a winter of unusual harshness to Oakhaven. The snow piled high, the winds howled like banshees, and the ice gripped the harbor in a relentless embrace. But colder and more relentless than any natural phenomenon was the fear that now consumed the town, a fear that had mutated into a virulent hatred for Evelyn Harrow. The tragic loss of Elias, the chilling tales of the black dog, and the ceaseless pronouncements from the girl's glass eye had pushed the townsfolk beyond reason. They saw her not as a victim, but as the source of their suffering, a malevolent force demanding appeasement. It was on Candlemas Eve, February 1st, a night traditionally associated with purification and the turning of the year, that the town's collective dread finally coalesced into action. Reverend Blackwood, now a gaunt, defeated man, had given up trying to reason with his flock. Dr. Finch had long since withdrawn. his scientific mind bewildered and his spirit broken by the unfolding tragedy. The Harrows were utterly alone. A secret meeting was held in the back room of the general store, its windows shuttered against the biting wind and the prying eyes of the night. Men, hardened by the sea and desperate from misfortune, spoke in hushed, angry tones. They recounted every ill fortune, every lost loved one, every spoiled harvest, laying it all at Evelyn's feet. The words witch and curse were no longer whispers. They were shouted, gaining momentum with each draught of cheap whiskey. Fear of the unknown had festered, turning into a righteous fury, a conviction that Oakhaven would never know peace as long as the glass-eyed girl breathed its air. Someone spoke of old ways, of ancient remedies for such afflictions, remedies whispered in the darkest corners of forgotten history. No one dared to utter the precise words aloud, but the implication hung heavy in the smoke-filled air. The black dog, too, was brought into the discussion, its spectral presence invoked as proof of Evelyn's unholy alliance. As the meeting dispersed into the bitter night, a sinister resolve hardened on the faces of the men. They would not tolerate the curse any longer. They would free Oakhaven from its shadow. The plan was not spoken in detail, but understood in the grim nods exchanged beneath the flickering gas lamps. There would be no trial, no mercy, only the desperate act of a terrified populace. Martha Harrow, alone in her cottage, felt a cold dread settle upon her, a mother's intuition screaming a warning she could not ignore. Evelyn, gazing out her window, her glass eye reflecting the distorted gleam of distant lanterns moving towards their isolated cottage, remained utterly silent. She saw it all, a miniature terrifying prophecy unfolding within her own terrible sight, a final, inescapable vision of her own demise. A profound dread, colder than any Maine winter, seized him. He knew what it meant. He knew what it always meant. He stood there, wrestling with the terror that a lifetime of faith could not quell. He could stay home. He could pretend the image was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by his weary mind. But years of ingrained habit and a desperate need to provide for his family warred with his fear. He was a fisherman. He had a living to make. He dismissed the vision, a bitter resentment hardening his heart against his own child and the cruel fate she seemed to embody. He kissed Martha on the cheek, bid Evelyn a quiet goodbye, and walked out into the cold dawn. He never returned. The Harrows waited by the shore all day, their hearts a silent drumbeat of anxiety. The news arrived with the next tide. Elias's dory was found splintered and capsized near the treacherous reefs of Blackwood Point, a notoriously difficult patch of water that Elias had navigated 1,000 times. The body of Elias Harrow was never recovered. The sea, which had given him his life, had now claimed it, a grim fulfillment of the vision in his daughter's eye. With the loss of Elias, Martha was broken. She no longer had the will to defend her daughter, to pretend, to hope. She simply existed, a figure of profound grief, her faith shattered. The town, having lost one of their own to the curse, now saw Evelyn not just as an omen, but as an active agent of misfortune, a vessel for the devil's own designs. The Harrows' isolation was now absolute. They were a family of ghosts, living in a house of sorrows, a monument to a father lost to the sea, and a daughter who could see the end before it began. And as the dark weeks stretched into months, the glass eye remained, silent but observant, a cold and perfect mirror to the tragedy it had foretold. With the loss of Elias, Oakhaven's fear of Eve, Lynn Harrow transformed into a dark, superstitious certainty. They no longer saw her as a simple girl with a strange affliction, but as a living curse, a wicked embodiment of bad luck. And as winter gave way to spring, a new chilling detail was added to the town's grim folklore. People began to speak of a black dog, not a normal dog, but a creature of impossible darkness, a phantom hound that appeared only on the most moonless nights. Its eyes, they said, glowed with an eerie ember-like light, and its presence was a harbinger of death. The dog was never seen by many at once, but its sightings were always followed by a misfortune, a barn fire, a child's fever, or a fisherman lost at sea. It was a local legend, a chilling tale told around hearths on cold nights. Then the stories began to change. The black dog, people whispered, had been seen on the outskirts of the Harrow property. Young boys dared each other to go near the house and swore they saw the shadowy form of a hound sitting patiently by the door. Old Mrs. Gable claimed to have seen it in the Harrows' yard, its glowing eyes fixed on Evelyn's bedroom window. The most terrifying account came from a poacher who, caught by the game warden, had sworn he saw the hound not outside the house, but sitting in the very parlor, a silent, menacing sentry by Evelyn's side. The legend of the black dog now had a grim connection to the glass-eyed girl. It was believed that the dog was a guardian spirit of a malevolent force, drawn to Evelyn's unique ability. Some said the dog was a familiar, a demonic companion that guided her sight. Others whispered that the dog was a ghost of her own future, a symbol of the darkness her eye would ultimately bring forth. Evelyn, now a ghost herself in her own home, spent her days in silent isolation. She rarely ventured outside, and when she did, she wore a thick bonnet, not just to hide her face from the world, but to hide her eye from the very things it seemed to attract. Madame Dubois arrived in Oakhaven under a veil of secrecy, a figure of dramatic contrasts in the drab fishing village, adorned in dark velvets and silver jewelry, exuding an aura of theatrical mysticism. She was a woman of sharp intelligence, her eyes keenly assessing the Harrows, and particularly Evelyn, whose detached silence seemed to intrigue her. For 3 days, Madame Dubois conducted her sessions in the Harrow parlor, transforming the humble room into a dimly lit chamber of incense and hushed incantations. She sat across from Evelyn, holding the child's small hands, her gaze fixed on the infamous glass eye. She claimed to be receiving impressions, vibrations, echoes from the other side. Madame Dubois spoke of a powerful psychic resonance, an involuntary conduit for temporal anomalies, a rare gift that allowed Evelyn to perceive the fractured tapestry of time itself. She theorized that the glass eye, being an inert non-living medium, amplified this gift, acting as a passive receiver, a window into future possibilities and past events. She spoke of the spirits of the recently departed, lingering near, attracted to Evelyn's unique sensitivity, their final unspoken truths, sometimes glimpsed in the reflective depths of the glass. For a brief, hopeful period, Martha allowed herself to believe. Perhaps Evelyn was not cursed, but merely misunderstood, a child with an extraordinary, albeit terrifying, ability. Madame Dubois spoke of teaching Evelyn to control her visions, to channel her psychic energy, to protect herself from the overwhelming deluge of information. But as the days wore on, a profound weariness settled upon the spiritualist. Her dramatic pronouncements grew subdued. Her eyes, once so confident, now held a flicker of genuine fear. On her final evening, Madame Dubois emerged from a session pale and shaken. She declined Martha's offer of tea, her voice tight. She confessed that Evelyn's gift was too powerful, too raw, too inherently untamed. "It is not a conduit," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the parlor wall. "It is a prison, and what it shows without mercy or discretion. There is no controlling it, only enduring it." She then hastily packed her bags, accepting only a fraction of her agreed-upon fee. As she departed in the dead of night, her final words to Dr. Finch, delivered in a hushed, trembling tone, echoed with a chilling finality. "The child sees everything that touches Oakhaven, the past, the future, and the darkest heart of its people. God help her when they truly understand." Her departure left the Harrows not only bereft of hope, but more isolated and vulnerable than ever, with the chilling realization that even those who claimed to understand the unseen could offer no refuge from Evelyn's terrible gaze. The final devastating blow to the Harrow family came not from a hostile town, but from the sea that had always sustained them. Elias Harrow, a man who had weathered a lifetime of storms, both on and off the water, was worn down to a shadow of his former self. The constant fear and isolation had taken their toll. His sole comfort was the rhythm of the ocean, the one constant in his life. But even that was soon to be tainted by the dreadful sight of his daughter's eye. One raw, gray morning in the spring of 1891, Elias was preparing to leave for his fishing grounds. As he stood by the door, pulling on his oilskins, he paused to look back at his daughter, who was sitting silently by the hearth. The firelight flickered across her face, catching her glass eye. Elias froze. He saw it, plain as day, a reflection within the glass, not of the glowing embers, but of his own dory, the Martha, upside down in the choppy surf, a stark, broken silhouette against a tumultuous sea. The image was vivid, horrifying, and utterly unmistakable. The simmering resentment in Oakhaven finally boiled over one sweltering summer evening in 1888, when Evelyn Harrow was 15. The air was thick with the scent of pine and salt, and an oppressive stillness hung over the town, a quiet before a storm that would shake Oakhaven to its foundations. It was the night the old Marsh Road meeting house burned. The meeting house, a simple wooden structure, had stood for generations, a pillar of the community, holding both religious services and town gatherings. It was old, dry, and vulnerable. On that fateful evening, a communal supper was planned, but a sudden illness kept Martha and Evelyn at home. Elias, however, had gone ahead to help set up. As dusk settled, casting long, distorted shadows across the Harrow cottage, Martha was tending to Evelyn, who complained of a headache. Suddenly, Evelyn sat bolt upright, her natural eye wide with pain, but her glass eye fixed and unnervingly bright. Martha, startled, saw within its reflective surface a chaotic, dancing orange glow, twisted and miniature, like a tiny bonfire. Then, a distorted image of flickering timbers and smoke, almost like a living thing, seemed to pulse within the glass. Evelyn let out a small, terrified gasp, pointing vaguely towards the east. Martha, her heart seizing with a primal dread, rushed to the window. In the distance, a faint plume of smoke was visible, growing rapidly against the darkening sky. A few frantic minutes later, the church bells began to clang, not with their usual Sunday chime, but with a frantic, desperate peal. The fire alarm. The meeting house was ablaze. By the time Elias returned, soot-stained and shaken, the wooden structure was little more than embers. Miraculously, no lives were lost, as the fire had started unexpectedly early, before the supper began in earnest. But the incident galvanized the town's latent hostility. Witnesses swore they had seen Evelyn Harrow staring towards the east from her porch, her strange eye glowing, mere moments before the alarm. The fact that the Harrows had not been at the meeting house was quickly twisted from a fortunate escape into a damning coincidence. The next morning, stones were thrown at the Harrow cottage windows, shattering the glass and sending shards across Martha's pristine floor. Crude, menacing symbols were spray-painted on their front door. No longer content with whispers, the townsfolk openly accused Evelyn of causing the fire, of being an agent of destruction, her eye not just foretelling, but commanding catastrophe. Reverend Blackwood tried to calm the angry mob, reminding them of Christian charity, but his words were drowned out by shouts of "Witch!" and "Get her out!" Elias, pale with fear and fury, stood guard with his old fishing gaff, protecting his family from the escalating rage. The fire on Marsh Road had not only destroyed a building, it had irrevocably ignited the town's terrifying belief that Evelyn Harrow's glass eye was not just a mirror to misfortune, but its instigator. Oakhaven now saw her not as a girl, but as a curse made flesh, and their fear was fast becoming a murderous intent. Driven to the brink by the town's escalating hostility, Elias and Martha Harrow found themselves in a terrible bind. Oakhaven was no longer safe for Evelyn. They couldn't leave, for they had no means, no kin elsewhere, and nowhere to go. Their only remaining hope lay in a radical, almost unthinkable solution: seeking help from a spiritualist, a practitioner of the arcane arts of communication with the dead. Dr. Finch, haunted by his own failures and increasingly convinced of Evelyn's preternatural nature, secretly arranged for a visit from a renowned medium from Boston, a Madame Celeste Dubois, whispered to have successfully communed with spirits and understood otherworldly phenomena. The attempts of both priest and pagan mystic offered no resolution, only deepened the shadow of doubt and fear. Reverend Blackwood, now visibly strained, continued his sermons, but they now carried an undertone of grim resignation. He no longer vehemently denied the presence of something inexplicable. Rather, he cautioned against seeking to understand what God had chosen to veil. Dr. Finch, witnessing this retreat from rational and spiritual explanation alike, felt a profound loneliness in his understanding. Evelyn Harrow remained, her innocent face framed by that unnerving reflective orb, a living question mark that defied both faith and reason. And as Oakhaven plunged deeper into winter's embrace, the chilling pronouncements of the glass eye grew bolder, painting ever more vivid portraits of the tragedies that awaited. The visions reflected in Evelyn Harrow's eye were no longer just glimpses of tragedy. They were becoming a source of terror and a reason for blame. The people of Oakhaven, unable to comprehend or control the supernatural, began to lash out at its most visible vessel. The fear that had once clung to them like a damp fog now solidified into outright hostility. Children were forbidden from playing with Evelyn. Mothers would quickly usher their little ones away if they saw her approach, clutching them tightly as if to shield them from a contagion. Shopkeepers, who had known the Harrows for years, would suddenly find themselves too busy to serve Elias, their eyes darting nervously to the small, silent girl standing beside him. The community, once a tapestry of interwoven lives, began to unravel, thread by thread, with Evelyn as the frayed knot at its center. Elias and Martha, once heartbroken, were now fiercely protective. They tried to shield their daughter from the venomous stares and whispered accusations, but it was impossible. The family became cities, solid, their home a silent island in a sea of animosity. Elias, already a man of few words, grew sullen and withdrawn, his shoulders bowed under the weight of his daughter's reputation. Martha, her once bright faith now a fragile flicker, would often weep in the dark hours of the night, asking God why they had been so cursed. One particularly harsh spring, a young boy from a prominent family fell and broke his leg, a seemingly random accident. But a few days prior, Evelyn had been seen staring at the boy from a distance, her glass eye reflecting a tiny, grotesque vision of a snapped tree branch. The boy's father, a loud and belligerent man, came to the Harrow home, his face contorted with rage. He pounded on their door, shouting curses and accusing Evelyn of being a witch and a harbinger of evil. Elias, though intimidated, stood his ground, defending his daughter with a rare and desperate fury. The incident was a turning point. The whispers gave way to open threats. The town's quiet malevolence had found a voice, and it was loud, ugly, and filled with the kind of primal fear that pushes people to do unspeakable things. Evelyn, who had always been so detached, finally began to show the strain. She would flinch at loud noises and pull her bonnet low, trying to hide the eye that was no longer a personal affliction, but a public spectacle. The once gentle girl, once the quiet symbol of a family's hope, was now a pariah, a living embodiment of the town's darkest superstitions, and a scapegoat for all its misfortunes. The stage was set, and the shadows were gathering for a final tragic act. Desperate for answers beyond the realm of conventional medicine, Dr. Finch delved into forbidden texts, volumes on ancient folklore, studies of the occult, even accounts of prophetic visions. He read of evil eyes, of second sight, of objects imbued with preternatural powers. He found parallels, but no definitive explanation for Evelyn's condition. He considered the possibility of a shared delusion, a mass hysteria gripping Oakhaven. But Evelyn's detachment, her seeming ignorance of the very visions she harbored, argued against it. One evening, after observing Evelyn staring blankly at the wall, her glass eye reflecting a tiny distorted image of a crumbling gravestone, Dr. Finch felt a profound chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. He asked Evelyn what she saw. She merely tilted her head, her natural eye innocent, and pointed vaguely at the reflected image. "A stone," she whispered. The very next day, old Mrs. Albright, frail and bedridden, finally succumbed to her illness, and her burial plot was indeed marked by a gravestone that had long been decaying. Dr. Finch closed his journal that night, his hand trembling. He had exhausted the limits of science. He was no longer trying to cure a physical malady, but to comprehend a terrifying truth. Evelyn Harrow's glass eye was not merely a prosthetic. It was an oracle, an unwitting window to fate, and its pronouncements were becoming increasingly clear and increasingly grim. With science having offered no solace or explanation, the people of Oakhaven, and indeed Dr. Finch himself, turned to other avenues, those realms of belief and mysticism that lay beyond the cold, hard facts of the observable world. The problem of Evelyn Harrow was no longer merely medical, it was spiritual. Reverend Blackwood, a man of God whose faith had always been an unyielding anchor in the stormy seas of life, initially dismissive, said the tales of Evelyn's eye as mere superstition, the workings of an overactive, fearful imagination. But even his resolute conviction began to waver under the relentless tide of events. When the fisherman's son drowned after Evelyn's glass eye had shown his mother the capsized dory, Reverend Blackwood spent a sleepless night in prayer. He visited the Harrows, not with medical advice, but with solemn biblical verses, speaking of God's mysterious ways and the temptations of dark forces. He gently laid his hand on Evelyn's head, attempting to impart a blessing, to cleanse whatever unseen taint clung to her. As he did, he swore he felt a distinct coldness emanating from her left side, a chill that seemed to sink into his very bones, a coldness that did not belong to a child's innocent flesh. Driven by a growing sense of spiritual dread, Reverend Blackwood sought counsel beyond the rigid doctrines of the church. He quietly contacted a wise woman from the outskirts of a neighboring, more remote settlement. A woman whispered to possess ancient knowledge, a kind of folk shaman. This woman, with eyes as old as the mountains, came to Oakhaven under the cloak of twilight, brought by Dr. Finch under the guise of an old family friend. She sat with Evelyn for a long hour, not speaking, but observing with an intensity that made Martha Harrow profoundly uneasy. The wise woman made no grand pronouncements. She simply held Evelyn's small hand, tracing patterns on her palm, and occasionally glanced at the glass eye, her own ancient gaze unblinking. Before she left, she spoke only 2 cryptic sentences to Dr. Finch and the Reverend. "It sees the threads of fate, woven by hands beyond our knowing, and it hungers not for sight, but for truth." She then gifted Evelyn a small, intricately carved wooden bird, urging Martha to keep it always near the child. It was a gesture of protection, or perhaps a warning. Mrs. O'Malley, standing beside her, recalled how the girl's face remained utterly blank, yet the artificial eye seemed to cloud over, then momentarily flash with a stark, terrifying image. A capsized dory, its hull splintered, tossing in the merciless waves. Mrs. O'Malley, a pragmatic woman, tried to dismiss it, but the vividness haunted her. Hours later, news arrived. The sea serpent, a dory belonging to young Finn O'Malley, had indeed capsized, claiming his life and the lives of 2 others. From that day, a new dread entered the collective consciousness of Oakhaven. It wasn't always capsized boats, however. there were smaller, yet equally unsettling predictions. Old Man Hemlock, known for his prized herd of cattle, scoffed at the child's fancy when someone mentioned Evelyn's unsettling gaze. Yet, 2 days before his prize heifer broke its leg in a freak accident, Evelyn had been seen staring intently at his pasture, her glass eye reflecting a miniature, distorted image of the animal thrashing in agony. A week later, when the town well suddenly ran dry, Evelyn had been observed by the well-digger's boy, gazing into its depths with that same unnerving stillness, the glass reflecting a tiny parched fissure at the bottom. Dr. Finch, now older and wearier, found himself increasingly disturbed. He made attempts to study the eye, to ascertain if there was some peculiar optical phenomenon at play, a trick of light or angle. But there was nothing. It was a simple glass prosthetic, flawlessly crafted, yet it behaved as no ordinary glass should. Reverend Blackwood's sermons against superstition grew more fervent, almost desperate, as the congregation's faith began to fracture under the weight of these inexplicable events. Evelyn herself seemed strangely detached from the terror she unwittingly caused. When confronted, she would simply shrug, her natural eye wide with a child's confusion, while the glass one remained placid, a silent, unblinking witness to futures yet unwritten, and to the chilling realization that in Oakhaven, the line between seeing and knowing had become fatally blurred. The mounting evidence of Evelyn Harrow's unique, terrifying gift, or curse, finally compelled Dr. Finch to abandon his purely medical explanations. He was a man of science, trained in the rational thought of the late 19th century, yet what he observed defied every law of optics, every known function of the human body. The village's growing fear was no longer mere superstition to him. It was a symptom of something profoundly inexplicable, centered around a small girl and her artificial eye. Dr. Finch began a meticulous, almost obsessive investigation. He spent hours in the Harrow home, ostensibly checking on Evelyn's general health, but truly, he was there to observe. He would position her near windows, under lamplight, even by the hearth, watching her glass eye with a magnifying lens, seeking any trick of reflection, any subtle distortion. He introduced objects into her field of vision, then removed them, trying to correlate her unseeing eye's reflections with events real or imagined. He even sketched the fleeting images he sometimes swore he saw within its depths. Once, a distant smoking chimney stack that, days later, materialized as the aftermath of a fire in a neighboring farm. Another time, a broken fishing net that presaged a poor haul for Elias. He consulted colleagues in Boston, discreetly describing a patient with an unusual optical anomaly, carefully omitting the supernatural implications. Their responses were uniform: a rare form of blindness, perhaps a manufacturing flaw in the prosthetic, or simply the psychological projection of anxious parents. None of these sterile explanations resonated with Dr. Finch, who had witnessed felt too much of the palpable dread Evelyn's presence now inspired. The curious nature of Evelyn Harrow's glass eye remained, for a time, a hushed topic among the women of Oakhaven, spoken in low tones over mending and tea. It was considered impolite to dwell on a child's misfortune, especially one born by the respectable Harrow family. Yet, like a persistent sea fog, the whispers gradually thickened, drifting from private parlors to the public square, fueled by small, inexplicable occurrences. Old Mrs. Gable, a woman known more for her tart tongue than her generosity of spirit, was the first to give voice to the growing unease beyond sympathetic murmurs. She lived next door to the Harrows, and one crisp autumn afternoon, she saw Evelyn sitting silently on her porch swing, her glass eye glinting oddly in the slanted sunlight. Mrs. Gable swore to her daughter later that evening, her voice a reedy tremor, that as she passed, she saw within the depths of that artificial orb not the reflection of the elm tree opposite, but a fleeting image of a shattered teacup, its porcelain fragmented on her own kitchen floor. Hours later, in a clumsy moment, she dropped her favorite heirloom teacup, breaking it into a dozen irreparable pieces. A coincidence, of course. The logical minds of Oakhaven insisted. But the incident sparked a flicker of dread. More disquieting still were the accounts from the children. Young Thomas Miller, a boisterous lad, claimed that during a game of hide-and-seek by the old mill pond, Evelyn, who was it, had turned, her glass eye fixed upon his hiding spot behind a thicket of blackberry bushes. "She couldn't see me, Papa," Thomas insisted, his face pale. "But her eye, it showed me a fish, stuck on a hook, thrashing in the air, and she knew exactly where I was." Moments later, his own father, out fishing for supper, snagged his line on a submerged branch, yanking it back with such force that a small fish caught it, inadvertently flew through the air, mirroring the boy's chilling vision. These anecdotes, small on their own, began to accumulate, each adding another grain of sand to the growing dune of superstition. Dr. Finch, a man of science, dismissed them as mere happenstance, fueled by suggestion and the overactive imaginations of a fearful populace. Reverend Blackwood, the stern but fair-minded minister, preached sermons on the dangers of gossip and the sin of attributing God's mysteries to darker forces. But even as they spoke, their words lacked the conviction to quell the rising tide of apprehension. For in the hushed corners of the parish hall, after Sunday service, the women exchanged knowing glances, their voices dropping to a bare murmur, as they spoke of Evelyn Harrow and the unsettling dull gleam that seemed to hold a mirror to things that had not yet come to pass, or perhaps things that were never meant to be seen at all. The fear, once a whisper, was beginning to find its voice. As Evelyn Harrow moved from childhood into the delicate cusp of adolescence, the whispers around her glass eye ceased to be mere gossip. They transformed into grim predictions. The incidents became more frequent, more distinct, and invariably more tragic. The dull, reflective orb, once dismissed as a consequence of childhood illness, was now openly spoken of as an omen, a chilling harbinger of ill tidings. The first truly public and undeniable incident occurred during a particularly brutal winter in 1885, when Evelyn was 12 years old. The fishing fleet was out, battling an unexpected violent squall. The wives and mothers of Oakhaven gathered anxiously by the docks, scanning the tumultuous gray horizon. Evelyn stood amongst them, small and quiet, her simple woolen cloak drawn tight against the biting wind. Suddenly, her head snapped up, her glass eye fixed on the roiling waves. Left seemed different. It lacked the lustrous warmth of its twin. Instead, it was dull, slightly opaque, and held a peculiar stillness. It was as if the fever, in its fierce departure, had left behind a cold, unseeing pain. Dr. Finch, when summoned, examined the child with a grave face. He spoke in hushed tones of optic nerve damage, of a rare consequence of high fever, and gently explained that her left eye was likely blind, the vision forever lost. He suggested it might even be prudent, in time, to consider a prosthetic for cosmetic purposes. Elias clenched his jaw, devastated by this cruel twist of fate, but Martha, ever practical, focused on her daughter's survival. Evelyn, for her part, seemed unbothered, adapting to her limited vision with the innate resilience of a child. But it was not merely a loss of vision. There was something else, something fundamentally other about that eye, an unsettling quality that neither Dr. Finch, nor Elias, nor even Martha, with all her motherly affection, could fully articulate. It was a secret it held, a subtle reflective gleam that would, in the years to come, betray its true and terrifying nature, a silent witness to horrors yet unseen. The diagnosis of blindness in Evelyn's left eye brought with it a sorrowful acceptance for the Harrow family. They learned to adjust, to guide her with a gentle hand, and to speak of it as a cross to bear with grace. Dr. Finch, true to his word, soon returned with a new form of treatment. He presented Martha with a small, carefully crafted orb, a prosthetic eye fashioned from glass to closely match Evelyn's remaining brown iris. It was a marvel of the era's nascent artistry, meant to restore a semblance of normalcy, to make Evelyn appear whole again in a world that often recoiled from imperfection. Martha, with trembling fingers, learned to set the delicate sphere into Evelyn's socket. At first, it was a cumbersome, unsettling process for both mother and child. Evelyn, only 3 years old, would wince, but never cried, regarding the procedure with that same unnerving stillness she had exhibited as an infant. Once in place, the effect was undeniably striking. The girl looked complete. The prosthetic shimmered, perfectly mimicking the light and shade of a natural eye, a testament to the glassblower's skill. Yet it was precisely this uncanny perfection that began to sow the first seeds of disquiet. For the glass eye, unlike its natural counterpart, did not merely reflect the light of the room. It seemed to capture it, to hold it, and sometimes to bend it in ways that defied natural optics. In certain angles, in specific qualities of light, it would catch a gleam that was not merely a surface reflection, but something deeper, colder, like a fragment of polished ice. It was a dull, reflective quality, as the old ones would say, like the bottom of a well or a shard of obsidian dredged from the deepest sea. The first whispers of its true strangeness came from the very young children who lacked the filter of adult reason. Evelyn, restored to play with her peers, would be found staring blankly, her glass eye fixed on some unseen point. Other children, drawn by an instinctual unease, would shrink from its gaze. "It looks right through you," one child declared to his mother, his voice trembling. "And sometimes it shows me things." The mothers, of course, scolded their imaginative offspring, attributing such talk to childish fancy. But even Martha, holding Evelyn close, sometimes felt a chill when her daughter's glass eye, seemingly blind and inert, would catch the lamplight just so, and for a fleeting instant, appear to hold a tiny, distorted image that wasn't there a moment before. It was a window, not to the world outside, but to something far more intricate, far more ancient, waiting for its secrets to spill. Babe. They knew nothing then of the peculiar affliction, or perhaps the peculiar gift, that lay dormant behind those innocent eyelids, waiting for the world to open itself to its strange reflective gaze. It was a detail so slight, so easily overlooked, that when it finally revealed itself, it did so not with a shout, but with a whisper that would echo through generations. The early years of Evelyn Harrow's life in Oakhaven passed much like the gentle ebb and flow of the tide, marked by the changing seasons and the simple routines of a fisherman's family. She grew from an infant into a quiet toddler, her disposition sweet, her eyes a deep, inquisitive brown. There was, for a time, nothing to distinguish her from any other child scampering along the dusty paths of the village, chasing after gulls or collecting seashells by the shore. Elias and Martha, relieved after their previous losses, cherished her with a quiet ferocity, seeing in her healthy growth a sign of divine favor and a balm for their past sorrows. Then came the spring of 1876, when Evelyn was but 3 years old. A particularly virulent fever swept through Oakhaven, claiming the weakest and leaving even the strongest profoundly shaken. Evelyn too succumbed. For days, her small body burned, her breathing shallow, her cries weak. Martha, desperate, nursed her tirelessly, praying over her daughter's fevered brow with every breath. The village doctor, a gruff but kind man named Dr. Finch, did what he could. But medicine in those days was often as much prayer as science. Slowly, agonizingly, Evelyn rallied. The fever broke, her skin cooled, and the color began to return to her lips. Elias and Martha wept with relief, convinced their prayers had been answered. But as Evelyn recovered, a subtle alteration became apparent, something Martha first noticed in the dim light of dawn. One of Evelyn's eyes, In the annals of New England's forgotten corners, nestled where the wild Atlantic gnaws at the granite coast and ancient pines stand sentinel against the relentless gales, lies the spectral memory of Oak Haven, Maine. It was a place not unlike 1,000 others dotting that rugged shore, sturdy folk, hard lives, and a deep-seated reverence for both God and the old ways of the sea. But in the year of our Lord 1873, Oak Haven was touched by a birth that would, in time, unravel its very fabric of peace, weaving a thread of chilling mystery that persists even to this twilight hour. The Harrow family were unremarkable in their virtues and their struggles. Elias Harrow, a fisherman whose hands were as gnarled as the ropes he hauled, was a man of few words and profound anxieties. His wife, Martha, was a quiet, devout woman, her days filled with the rhythm of domesticity and the soft hum of hymns. They had weathered the loss of 2 infants to the harsh realities of the century, and thus, when Martha brought forth a healthy baby girl on a blustery autumn evening, a fragile joy settled upon their humble cottage. They named her Evelyn. Evelyn Harrow was, by all accounts, a child of delicate beauty in her earliest months. Her skin was fair, her hair a shade of burnished oak, and her features, though tiny, hinted at a gentle grace. Yet, even in those nascent days, a shadow, faint as a passing cloud, seemed to cling to her, unnoticed by the adoring parents, but perhaps sensed by the keen, untamed spirit of Oak Haven itself. The midwives and neighbors remarked on her unusual quietness, a stillness that sometimes felt less like slumber and more like a profound, watchful observation. Elias often found himself simply staring into her cradle, a vague disquiet stirring in his chest, an instinct he couldn't quite name. Martha, ever the optimist, would dismiss it as the peacefulness of a bee,